The man hit the pavement outside Redwood Memorial at 11:47 p.m. with a wound in his side that was killing him faster than anyone in that trauma bay had ever seen. The attending physician called it unsurvivable. The charge nurse called for comfort measures. 3 residents backed away from the table. And then Evelyn Cross, triage nurse, 41 years old, the woman nobody looked at twice, stepped forward, reached into the supply cart without asking permission, and did something with her hands that none of them had ever seen outside of a combat zone. 40 seconds later, the bleeding stopped. The room went silent, and nobody in that hospital would ever be the same again. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where you need to be. Follow this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like if you're already feeling it, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go. The call came in at 11:31 p.m. A man found unresponsive in a parking lot 3 blocks from the hospital, no wallet, no ID, GSW to the lower left abdomen with what the paramedics described on the radio as active and uncontrolled hemorrhage. By the time the ambulance backed into the bay, the lead paramedic was pressing both hands into the wound, and his face had the particular gray look of someone who had already made peace with losing the patient. Evelyn Cross was finishing her incident report on at the triage station when the bay doors blew open. She didn't run. She stood up slowly, capped her pen, and walked toward the noise the way someone walks toward a sound they've heard before and aren't afraid of. The trauma team was already assembling. Dr. Marcus Hale, chief of surgery, came through the corridor doors still tying his scrub cap, shoulders forward, voice loud. He had the kind of authority that filled a room before he said a single word, and he used it freely. "Talk to me," he said. "Male, approximate age 50, GSW, left lower quadrant," the paramedic rattled off. "Pressure's been dropping since we found him. 80 over palp when we loaded. We couldn't maintain access. IV blew twice. He's been in and out." They moved the gurney through the trauma bay doors, and the overhead fluorescence caught the patient's face, pale, slack, sheened with cold sweat. The wound itself was a bad one. Not the worst Evelyn had ever seen, but bad. The bleeding wasn't coming from where most people would have assumed. She could see that from 6 feet away. She moved to the left side of the gurney. "Cross." Dr. Hale's voice didn't look at her. "Get me an ultrasound, and stay out of the way." She reached for the ultrasound probe anyway, and positioned it before anyone could object. The image that came back was what she expected. She said nothing. The second-year resident, Dr. Priya Osman, was trying to get a line in and failing. The patient's veins had collapsed. She tried the left antecubital, missed, tried again. The monitor screamed a warning. Pressure, 68 over 40. "We're losing him," someone said. "Get a central line kit." "There's no time for a central line." "Then what do you suggest?" Evelyn set down the probe. She moved to the supply cart on the wall and opened the second drawer from the bottom. She pulled out a 14-gauge needle, a length of extension tubing, and the kind of pressure dressing that wasn't standard issue in most emergency departments, but had been sitting in that drawer for 3 years because she had specifically requested it be stocked, and nobody had ever asked why. "Cross, I told you to stand down." Dr. Hale's voice went up a register. She had already pulled on gloves. "The bleed isn't where you're looking," she said. "It's tracking posterior. The external wound is a distraction. He has a fragment, probably secondary shrapnel, sitting against the left internal iliac. Pressure there will buy you 6 minutes, maybe 7. The room turned to look at her. Dr. Hale's face did something complicated. "That's speculation. You don't have imaging. The ultrasound showed it. Look at the screen." She didn't wait. She moved to the patient's left side, found the landmark she wanted by touch alone, and applied targeted compression at an angle that none of the residents had been trained to use because it came from a field manual, not a textbook. The bleeding slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. But in a room where everyone had been watching a man die by fractions, slowing was everything. Nobody spoke for 4 seconds. Then the monitor showed 62 over 38, 59 over 35. Then, slowly, like something reluctant, 65 over 40. "He's stabilizing," Dr. Osman said, and her voice cracked on the last word. Evelyn held her position. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing was even. She watched the monitor with the detached attention of someone doing math in their head, not someone standing at the center of a crisis. Dr. Hale stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the monitor, then back at her. "Get me a vascular surgeon," he said to the room. "Now." The vascular surgeon, Dr. Tomas Reyes, arrived 14 minutes later and took the patient directly to OR3. By then, Evelyn had stepped back to the edge of the room. She pulled her gloves off, dropped them in the bin, and returned to the triage station. She had 3 more incident reports to finish. Dr. Osmond found her there 20 minutes later. The resident still had the particular look of someone who had just watched something they didn't understand but knew was important. "How did you know where the fragment was?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not accusatory, genuinely curious in the way that young doctors sometimes were before the system worked it out of them. Evelyn didn't look up from her paperwork. Mechanism of injury, entry angle, the way the paramedic was holding pressure. He was compensating without knowing it. The body was telling you where the problem was. You just have to know how to read it. That's not something we learn in residency. No, Evelyn agreed. It isn't. Osmond stood there a moment longer, waiting for more. Evelyn went back to her report. Eventually, the resident walked away. Dr. Hale found her at 1:15 a.m. He came around the corner of the triage station and planted himself in front of her desk, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and she knew before he opened his mouth that this conversation was not going to be about gratitude. "You want to explain to me what that was?" he said. Evelyn set her pen down. "I helped stabilize a patient." "You performed an unauthorized intervention on a trauma patient, bypassed attending physician authority, and used a technique that isn't in any protocol this hospital recognizes." He said it like he was reading from a document. Maybe he already was, in his head. "I need to know where you learned that." She looked at him steadily. He was 60, maybe 61, silver-haired, well-built, the kind of man who had been used to being the most competent person in a room for so long that he had stopped being able to imagine it any other way. "Some lessons," she said, "only come from war." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Hale's jaw moved like he was chewing something. "You were in the military." It wasn't a question exactly, more like something he was trying out loud to see if it fit. "That's in my personnel file," she said, which was both true and not an answer. "As a medic. Basic field training. That's what it says." "Yes," she said, "that's what it says." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without effort. Something in her stillness seemed to bother him. Most people, when Marcus Hale stared them down, broke within 30 seconds. Evelyn Cross was watching him with the calm, patient attention of someone who had sat across from scarier people in worse rooms and had come out the other side without changing her expression. "Go home," he finally said. "You're off the roster tomorrow while I review this." Evelyn picked up her pen. "I'm on day shift in 7 hours." "Not anymore, you're not." She finished the sentence she was writing before she responded. "Okay." He waited, apparently expecting more. When nothing came, he turned and walked away with the rigid posture of a man who wanted to look like he'd won something. She drove home through empty streets. The apartment was quiet and small, the way she liked it. A one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building in the older part of Ashford, where the streets had trees that were actually old and the sidewalks were uneven, and nobody expected you to make conversation in the elevator. She had lived there for 4 years. Before that, nowhere in particular. Before that was a different story, and one she didn't tell. She made tea she didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for a while. The patient's face kept surfacing, not the blood, not the monitor readings, not the moment the bleeding slowed. His face. There had been a moment, before he went fully under, when his eyes had opened, just for a second. He had looked at her. Not the ceiling, not the lights, her. She told herself she didn't recognize him. She went to bed at 2:30 a.m. and stared at the ceiling until 5. The call from hospital administration came at 8:47 the next morning. She was still in her apartment when her phone rang. Dr. Renata Bloom, Assistant Director of Clinical Operations, voice professionally neutral in a way that meant bad news had already been decided. "Evelyn, we need you to come in." "I was told I was off the roster." "That's correct. This is a different matter. Dr. Hale has filed a formal report regarding last night's incident. The board has requested a meeting at 10 o'clock. She came in wearing the same thing she always wore. Dark slacks, plain top, the same flat shoes she'd had for 2 years. No effort toward impression. She sat in the conference room across from Dr. Bloom and a man named Garrett Webb. who was on the hospital's legal team and had eyes like someone who had learned not to feel things in professional contexts. Dr. Hale was there too, at the head of the table, which told her all she needed to know about who had convened this meeting and who was running it. "We want to be clear," Dr. Bloom began, "that the board recognizes the patient is alive, and that's significant. However, Hale cut in, what you did last night constituted an unauthorized medical intervention. You're a licensed triage nurse, Evelyn, not a surgeon, not a trauma physician. You overstepped the scope of your position, you operated against direct attending physician instruction, and you used a technique that has no documentation in your training record." Evelyn said, "The patient would have died. That is not a defense." "I'm aware it isn't a defense. I'm stating a fact." Garrett Webb clicked his pen twice. "The hospital's position is that we cannot allow nursing staff to override attending physicians in trauma situations, regardless of outcome. Doing so creates liability. It creates precedent. It undermines the chain of authority that this institution depends on." She almost said something then. She could feel it, a sentence that would have been accurate and probably damaging, sitting right at the back of her teeth. She let it go. "So what's the next step?" she said instead. Dr. Bloom folded her hands. "We're placing you on administrative suspension, effective immediately, pending a full review of the incident. During that time, you are not permitted on hospital grounds in a professional capacity. You'll retain your salary through the review period, which should conclude within 10 business days." Evelyn looked at each of them in turn. Hale was watching her with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, more like relief, which was actually more revealing. A satisfied man had gotten what he wanted. A relieved man had been afraid he might not get it. "Understood," she said. She stood up, pushed the chair in neatly, and walked out. She was in the parking garage, 2 rows from her car, when she heard the doors behind her slam open. She turned. 4 people in dark suits were moving toward her at the speed of people who know exactly where they're going. 3 men, 1 woman. The woman was in front. She had the gait of someone who had done PT at 5 a.m. for the last 20 years and hadn't stopped yet. Her credentials were already out. "Evelyn Cross?" the woman said. "Yes." "Special Agent Dara Solis, Defense Intelligence Agency." She showed the badge briefly and put it away with practiced efficiency. "We need a moment." Evelyn looked at her. "You have it." Solis glanced at the men behind her. They spread out without being told, 1 toward each exit of the parking level, 1 staying close. Threat assessment. Coverage. She knew what this was. "We know about last night," Solis said. "The patient. What you did. The hospital seems aware as well." Solis almost smiled. "They know a fraction of it. We know the rest." She paused. "Captain Cross." The name landed in the empty parking garage and just sat there. Evelyn hadn't heard that particular word attached to her name in 6 years. It moved through her the way old fractures felt in cold weather, something that had healed imperfectly, making itself known. "I've been Evelyn Cross for a while now," she said quietly. "We know." Solis took a breath. "The man you saved last night. We've been running surveillance on him for 8 months. His name is Warren Falk, civilian alias. Real identity is classified, but suffice to say he's not someone who ended up bleeding in a parking lot by accident." The name didn't mean anything to her. She filed that fact carefully. "He surfaces in connection to a missing cache of military-grade explosives," Solis continued. 200 kilograms of compound ordnance that disappeared from a Ford supply depot in 2019. We have reason to believe he was part of a network that's been moving that material for 6 years. We've been trying to get to him for 8 months, and last night he showed up at your hospital." She paused again. "At your hospital specifically." Evelyn looked at her without blinking. "You're asking if I brought him there?" "I'm asking if you know him. The name Warren Falk means nothing to me. What about Sergeant First Class Dennis Rail, Bravo Element, 4th Special Operations Support Command, fiscal year 2019? The parking garage was very quiet. Evelyn's breathing didn't change. She had spent a long time getting very good at keeping her breathing from changing. "That mission is classified," she said. "It is, which is why I'm having this conversation with you out here instead of inside." Solis held her gaze. "Falk was on the perimeter of that operation. We think he was the source of the intelligence leak that got your team hit. 6 people went into that compound, Captain. You're the only one who came back." Something moved across Evelyn's face. She let it, just for a second. Then it was gone. I know how many people came back, she said. Solis was quiet for a moment. We need him alive. Whatever shape he's in right now, we need him to survive long enough to talk to us, which means we need you. I don't work for the DIA. We're not recruiting you. We're asking you to understand the situation. Solis took a step closer and lowered her voice. Falk is in surgery right now. When he comes out, he's going to be the most important witness we have to the location of 200 kilograms of stolen military explosives, a domestic distribution network, and the name of the officer who sold them out. You have access to that hospital. You have skills that— I just got suspended, Evelyn said. Solis looked at her steadily. We know. A silence that had several meanings. Then you also know, Evelyn said slowly, that I can't get back in there. Not as a nurse. Solis reached into her jacket and produced a lanyard with a credentials badge clipped to it. She held it out. But there are other ways to be in a building. Evelyn looked at the badge. She didn't take it yet. If Falk is connected to that operation, she said, then someone knows where he is right now. And if someone knows where he is, then others know he's alive, Solis finished. Yes, that's exactly the problem. She held the badge a little higher. We have approximately 3 hours before the people who shot him realize the hospital he was taken to. After that, this gets complicated fast. Evelyn took the badge. She turned it over in her hand, looked at the photo that was already on it. Taken from somewhere, she didn't want to think about when. DIA credentials in a federal consultant capacity. 3 hours, she said. Maybe less. Evelyn pocketed the badge and turned toward the parking garage exit. Then we shouldn't stand here. She took 4 steps before she stopped. Something had moved at the edge of her peripheral vision, the far corner of the parking level, near the stairwell. A car that had been there when she walked in, a dark blue sedan with rental plates, that now had someone sitting in it who hadn't been there before. She didn't point, didn't look directly, just went very still. Solis, she said, without turning, your 3 hours may have just gotten shorter. There was a beat of silence. Then she heard the agent shift behind her with the quiet, controlled movement of someone going from resting to ready without any wasted motion in between. Where? Solis said, low. Blue sedan, northwest corner, engines running, plates are rental. Person in the driver's seat wasn't there 6 minutes ago. Another beat. The sound of Solis speaking very quietly into a radio at her collar. Evelyn didn't move. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, the way she had been taught to. Not looking at a threat directly gave you more accurate peripheral data and gave them less warning that they'd been spotted. The sedan's headlights came on. We need to move, Solis said, and her voice had dropped all professional courtesy and gone flat and operational. Now, stay close. They moved toward the exit, and the sedan began to roll, slowly at first, then faster, angling toward the exit lane. Not toward them, not yet, but positioning, cutting off options. Evelyn watched the geometry of it, the angles, the lines of sight. She had 3 hours, maybe, before the people who had put a bullet in Warren Falk figured out where he was recovering. She was now fairly certain at least one of them already knew. The stairwell door behind them opened, not loudly. That was the thing that mattered. Not loudly, not with the casual noise of someone going about their day. It opened with the specific silence of someone who had practiced opening doors quietly, and that was a sound, or more precisely an absence of sound, that Evelyn Cross recognized immediately and completely. She turned. The man in the stairwell doorway was wearing paramedic blues that were just slightly wrong, the cut too narrow, the patches on the shoulders from a company that didn't operate in Ashford County. He was holding nothing visible, but his right hand was at his side in the position of someone who is about to be holding something. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in the half-second before Solis registered what was happening, Evelyn was already moving, not away, but sideways and forward, the particular diagonal that closed the distance and removed his angle at the same time, the technique that made no sense if you'd never been taught it, and made complete sense if you had. The sound the parking garage made after that was short and mechanical and not very loud. When it was over, the man in the paramedic blues was on the ground with Solis's people around him, and Evelyn was standing with her back to the nearest concrete column, breathing evenly, her hands at her sides. Solis stared at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "Captain," she said, very carefully, "we need to get you inside that hospital." Evelyn straightened her jacket. I know, she said. Warren Falk is waking up. And whatever he has to say, someone in that building is going to try very hard to make sure he never gets the chance. They moved fast through the stairwell, Solis's two remaining agents forming a loose wedge around Evelyn as they took the stairs up instead of down. Counterintuitive, which was the point. If anyone was watching the exits, they'd be watching the ground floor. The roof access corridor on the third level connected to the hospital's maintenance wing through a service bridge that most of the hospital staff didn't know existed. Evelyn knew because she had worked there for 4 years and had made it her business, quietly and without drawing attention, to know every way in and out of every building she spent time in. Old habit, the kind that didn't switch off. Solis was on her radio the whole way up. Her voice was clipped and precise, the particular shorthand of someone who had run enough field operations that full sentences felt like wasted syllables. Evelyn caught fragments. Secondary contact neutralized. East egress compromised. Asset moving to secondary point. And filed them without comment. They came through the maintenance corridor at a pace just below running, and Evelyn badged through the service door with the DIA credentials Solis had given her. The badge worked. She didn't ask how. The corridor on the other side smelled like industrial cleaner and old linoleum, and the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that gave most people headaches. She had always found it strangely calming. OR3 recovery suite is on the second floor, Evelyn said. East wing. But if he's still in post-op, they'll have him in the PACU off the main OR corridor. We have an agent already positioned on the second floor, Solis said, or we did 40 minutes ago. She touched her earpiece. I'm not getting confirmation now. That was not good information. Evelyn moved to the stairwell door and pushed through without waiting. The second floor was quieter than the main ER. The particular quiet of a place where people were either unconscious or trying not to disturb people who were. The PACU was at the end of the east corridor, behind a set of double doors with a narrow window. She looked through the window before pushing through. 2 nurses at the station, both with their backs to the door, neither of them moving with the particular attention that would indicate they knew something was wrong. 1 patient visible in Bay 1, another in Bay 3, curtain partially drawn. Bay 3, she said quietly. Solis pushed through with her. Her agent stayed at the corridor entrance. The nurse at the station started to turn. Excuse me, this is a restricted... Solis had her credentials out again. Federal business. We need 5 minutes with the patient in Bay 3. Nobody in or out of this unit until I say otherwise. She said it the way a person says something they've said before, with the expectation that it will work, and it did. The nurse sat back down with the expression of someone who had just decided this was above her pay grade. Evelyn went to Bay 3 and pulled back the curtain. Warren Falk was awake. She hadn't expected that. Post-op, fresh out of a vascular repair, he should have been 3 to 4 hours from coherent. But his eyes were open and tracking, and when she pulled the curtain back, they went directly to her face and stayed there. His color was still bad, that particular gray-yellow of serious blood loss. And he had the IV and the monitors and the oxygen line and all the rest. And he looked like a man who had made several very bad decisions over a very long period of time and was now being asked to pay for all of them at once. He looked at her for a long time. You, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. Me, she agreed. I told them. He stopped, gathered himself. His breathing was careful, like someone who had discovered that the wrong depth of breath pulled at something that hurt. When I asked for you specifically, when they brought me in. I asked for the triage nurse, the woman at the desk. Evelyn pulled a stool from the wall and sat down, close enough that he wouldn't have to raise his voice. She was aware of Solis standing just outside the curtain. Why? He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. Because I knew what you'd done. After the mission, after... He stopped. His jaw worked. I knew who you were. The mission was a long time ago. Yes, he said. It was. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again with what looked like an effort. What they told you about that night, it wasn't complete. Mr. Falk, my name isn't Falk. He said it flatly, without inflection. Hasn't been Falk for a long time. My name was... It doesn't matter. What matters is that I wasn't the one who gave the location. Evelyn was quiet. She had learned, a long time ago, that silence was the most efficient tool for making someone say what they actually meant to say. There was someone else on that signal, he said. Someone who gave the compound coordinates to 3 different parties and then let your team walk into it. I was there. I saw what they did. I've been running from them since 2020 because I was the only one who saw the whole picture, and they couldn't let that. He broke off and his hand moved toward his side. The monitors ticked up slightly. Easy, Evelyn said. Not warm exactly, but not cold. Steady. Breathe through it. He did. It took a moment. His hand dropped back to the mattress. I came here because I ran out of places to go, he said. They found my last location 3 weeks ago. I've been moving since then. When they caught up with me last night, he looked at her. I asked for you because I thought if anyone in this building would actually understand what I was trying to tell them, it would be the woman who was on that mission and came back alone. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Down the corridor, someone dropped something metal, and the sound rang briefly and went silent. Who else knows you're here? She said. His expression shifted slightly. Not fear exactly, something more tired than fear. That's the right question. I'm asking it. 2 people knew my travel pattern, he said. One of them is dead. The other one... He stopped again and his eyes went to the curtain behind her, and something in his face changed. The other one, he said slowly, should not have known which hospital. Evelyn turned. The curtain was exactly as she'd left it. Solis was visible through the small gap, her back partially to them, her hand at her ear. Nothing visibly wrong. But something in the way Falk had said those last words, the particular quality of a man who had spent 6 years surviving by reading rooms and calculating odds, made Evelyn stand up from the stool. She went to the curtain gap and looked out. The PACU was still quiet. The 2 nurses at the station hadn't moved. The double doors at the end of the corridor were closed. But the agent Solis had said was positioned on this floor, the one she wasn't getting confirmation from, was nowhere visible. And the door to the medication room at the far end of the unit was 5 inches open, which it hadn't been when they came in. She leaned towards Solis without stepping fully out. Your agent on this floor, what was his positioning? Solis turned slightly. Supply corridor adjacent to the PSU. The medication room? A pause. Solis looked down the corridor. Her expression didn't change, but her right hand moved to her side. No. Evelyn looked at the medication room door for one more second, then turned back to Falk. Is there a name? She said. The person who knew your travel pattern. Is there a name I should have? Falk's eyes were doing the thing again, reading the room, calculating. Hargrove, he said. Colonel Denton Hargrove. Logistics Command, Fort Merritt. He was the one who had access to the full deployment order that night. He was the one who... He stopped because Evelyn had already stepped back out through the curtain, and he was smart enough to know that the conversation had shifted into a register that was beyond what either of them could control from a hospital bed. Solis had moved to the medication room door. She was standing to the left of it, not in front, which was the correct way to approach a door you weren't sure about. She looked back at Evelyn. Evelyn crossed the PACU floor with 3 quiet steps and positioned herself on the right side. They looked at each other across the door frame. Solis held up 2 fingers, then pointed at herself, then at the door. Evelyn shook her head and gestured, herself first. Solis's expression made it clear she did not love this idea. Evelyn pointed to her own eyes, then to the gap in the door, communicating what she could see that Solis probably couldn't from her angle. Solis conceded with a slight tightening around her eyes that was as close to arguing as the situation allowed. Evelyn pushed the door open. The medication room was a standard PACU layout. 2 rows of locked cabinets, a small workstation, a window with frosted glass that looked onto the internal corridor. The room was empty. But the cabinet on the far right was standing open, which meant either someone had been in it or someone had left in a hurry and hadn't closed it. And on the floor near the workstation, very small, easy to miss, was a smear of something dark. Solis saw it at the same time. She crouched, didn't touch it. Recent, she said quietly. The frosted window had a latch. The latch was undone. Evelyn looked at the window, then at the floor, then at the medication cabinet. She had a picture forming in her head that she didn't like. Someone had come through this window from the internal corridor, access the cabinet. For what? She wasn't sure yet, but the options in a PACU medication room were not reassuring, and left the same way, or was still in the building and moving. "We need to sweep this floor," she said. "I have 2 agents downstairs." "Then get them up here and lock down the PACU. Falk doesn't go anywhere, and nobody comes in." She paused. "And find your missing agent." Solis was already on the radio. Evelyn went back to Falk's bay and pulled the curtain shut behind her. He was watching her with the eyes of a man who had been reading situations like this for a long time and knew exactly what was being communicated by the set of her shoulders. "They're already here," he said. "Possibly." "Not possibly." He pulled in a careful breath. "When they send people, they send them early. They find a position before the target knows they're in range. That's doctrine. That's how they operate." He paused. "That's how Hargrove taught them to operate." Evelyn stood at the foot of the bed and thought for a moment. She ran through the building in her head. Layout, access points, staff patterns, blind spots. She had spent 4 years noticing things, and now she was accessing all of it like pulling a filing system off a shelf. "How many people, typically?" she said. "A team, 3 to 5. 1 inside, 1 or 2 on egress points, 1 on communications." He looked at her. "They won't come in shooting. Too many witnesses, too complicated. They'll want to move him, make it look like a transfer, a transport order, an ambulance, something that has paperwork and looks legitimate until you're already 2 miles away." That was specific enough to be something he'd seen before. "There was a man in the parking garage," she said. "Paramedic uniform. Advanced positioning." He nodded slightly. "There'll be a vehicle outside. Documentation already prepared. They're waiting for a window." "What's the window?" "Shift change," he said. "Always shift change. New staff, distracted, processing handoffs. Nobody questions a transport order during shift change because everybody's too busy trying to catch up." Evelyn checked her watch. Day shift change at Redwood Memorial was 7 a.m. It was 6:41. 19 minutes. She found solace in the corridor outside the PACU with both of her downstairs agents, who had come up fast and were now positioned at the unit's 2 entry points. Evelyn told her what Falk had said about the transport window. Solace's expression didn't visibly shift, but she started moving before Evelyn finished the sentence. "I need to flag any transport orders generated in the last 6 hours for PACU patients," Solace said into her radio. "Cross-reference with admissions and check for any ambulance requests logged after midnight." She waited. 10 seconds. 20. The response came back, and whatever it said made her stop walking. She turned to Evelyn. "There's a transport order in the system for a patient in Bay 3. Time-stamped 6:15 a.m. Signed by Dr. Marcus Hale. Transfer to Meridian Regional for specialist consultation." Evelyn stood very still. "Hale," she said. "He's the attending of record." "He is." She thought about the meeting that morning, the administrative suspension, the way Hale had seemed more relieved than satisfied. Who would have told him which hospital Falk was taken to? Solis was already working the question. The ER intake would have logged it. It goes to the attending automatically when a patient from trauma is transferred to surgical. Hale was the attending who initially saw Falk, so he'd have received. "So Hale knew Falk was here from the moment the surgery was logged," Evelyn said. "And 6 hours later there's a transport order. It could be legitimate." "It could be," Evelyn said. "But Falk told me the person who knew his travel pattern shouldn't have known which hospital. If Hargrove's network has an inside connection, you think Hale is connected to Hargrove. I think a transport order generated at 6:15 a.m. to move a critical post-op patient to another facility before he's stable enough to move is not standard of care." She held Solis's gaze. "I think someone wants Falk in an ambulance because an ambulance is the easiest place to disappear a person between 2 points." Solis turned to her lead agent. "Cancel that transport, lock the order in the system, and don't let it clear." Then back to Evelyn. "We need to talk to Hale." "He'll be in the building for morning rounds," Evelyn said. "Started at 6:30. "Then let's find him." They moved toward the elevator, and Evelyn pushed the button for 4, where the surgical attending offices were, and watched the number climb. The hospital was coming alive around them. The early shift change noise, carts moving, someone on an overhead PA calling a department number twice. The sounds of an ordinary morning in a place where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at Solis, who nodded. She answered. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize, low and even. You should know that the patient you're protecting is not who Agent Solis told you he is. Evelyn kept her voice neutral. Who is this? That's not the relevant question. The relevant question is what you're going to do in the next 4 minutes. Because there's a woman on the second floor of that hospital right now who is not a nurse, and she's been in the building since 5 a.m., and she's carrying something that is not a medical device. The line went dead. Evelyn lowered the phone and looked at Solis. Someone just told me there's a hostile asset already inside, second floor, in place since 5 a.m. Solis's face went very still. Male or female? Female. A beat. Something crossed Solis's face, not surprise exactly. More like a thing confirmed that she'd been hoping wouldn't be. Did they say anything else? They said 4 minutes. The elevator doors opened. Neither of them got in. Second floor, Solis said, already pivoting. That's not the PACU. No, Evelyn said. That's the surgical ICU. She was already moving toward the stairs. The surgical ICU on the second floor shared a wall with the PACU recovery suite and connected through a service corridor that most of the medical staff used as a shortcut between departments. It also connected to the hospital's main oxygen and utility systems through a junction room that sat between the two units. And if someone had been in that building since 5 a.m. and was carrying something that wasn't a medical device, the junction room between a surgical ICU and a PACU was the specific location that Evelyn's training told her to think about first, because the utilities that ran through that room supplied both units completely and were the fastest and most catastrophic way to make a controlled environment suddenly uncontrolled. She hit the second floor stairwell door at speed and turned left. The service corridor was empty. The junction room door halfway down was closed. She checked the handle, not locked, which meant either it had been left unlocked or it had been unlocked deliberately. She looked back at Solis, who was 6 steps behind her with her hand under her jacket. 4 minutes, the voice had said. She pushed the door open. The junction room was about the size of a large closet, banks of valves and supply lines, the low hum of the HVAC system, overhead lighting that was motion-activated and flickered on when they entered. Standard maintenance space. It should have been completely empty. There was a woman crouching at the far bank of supply lines. She was in scrubs, her back to them, doing something with her hands that Evelyn couldn't see clearly. A bag was open on the floor beside her, dark, compact, the kind of bag that wasn't a medical kit. Stop, Solis said, and her voice was the particular flat sound of an order, not a request. The woman didn't stop. She moved, fast, sideways, not toward them, but toward the secondary panel on the left wall. And for a second, Evelyn had the angle and Solis didn't, and what she saw in the woman's hand was a small device with a display and a magnet back, and the display was already counting. Evelyn crossed the room in the time it took Solis to process and react. She was not elegant about it. She hit the woman's wrist before she could attach the device to the panel, and they went sideways into the supply line bank together, something metal catching Evelyn in the shoulder hard enough to send white through her vision, the device skittering across the floor. The woman was trained. She could feel that immediately, the way she recovered and drove an elbow that Evelyn only half blocked. But training and surprise work differently when they meet, and Evelyn had the advantage of having moved first. It took 40 seconds. Solis was there at the 30-second mark. When it was over, the woman was on the floor with her hands behind her back, and Solis's agent was on the radio. And Evelyn was crouched 3 feet away with her hand pressed to her shoulder and breathing in the deliberate way she used when something hurt enough that she needed to not think about it yet. The device on the floor had stopped counting at 1 minute and 12 seconds. Solis crouched next to it without touching it. "This is not a bomb," she said. "It's a signal disruptor. Would have knocked out every monitor and communication system on the second floor." She looked at Evelyn. Falk would have flatlined on paper. No alerts, no alarms. In the confusion, the transport, Evelyn said, the ambulance would have pulled up right at shift change. Paperwork in order, monitors down, nobody able to confirm his status. She straightened up slowly. Hargrove's network doesn't improvise. Falk was right. Solis stood. She looked at Evelyn's shoulder. "You need to get that looked at." "Later." "That's not..." "Later." Evelyn said again, and her voice had the quality of a door closing. Right now we need to find Hale, and we need to figure out whether the person who called me with the tip is an asset or a complication. Solis was quiet for a moment. It could be both. Yes, Evelyn said. It could be both. She straightened fully and moved toward the door. And we need to talk to Falk again, because he just told us Hargrove's name, and now someone used an unknown number to warn us about an operation Hargrove's people were running in this building. Which means either someone in Hargrove's network is flipping, or someone is trying to control what we know and when we know it. She stepped into the corridor. The hospital was louder now, proper shift change noise, the building filling up with the morning. Somewhere down the hall, a cart wheeled past with a sound like punctuation. She looked at her watch. 6:58 a.m., shift change. She looked at Solis. Where's the ambulance bay? Solis touched her earpiece, listened for 2 seconds, and her expression flattened into something that, in a less controlled person, would have been alarm. There's a unit in the bay right now, she said. Crew of 2. They've been there since 6:40 and nobody called them. Evelyn was already moving toward the stairwell. The transport order was canceled, Solis said, following. They shouldn't have any authorization to... They don't need authorization, Evelyn said. They have a window, and right now they think the second floor just lost all of its monitoring systems. She pushed through the stairwell door. They're going to move in the next 5 minutes whether the order cleared or not, because they think the building is blind and Falk is alone. She was 3 steps down when Solis's radio crackled with a voice she didn't recognize, tight and fast. Solis, we've got a problem on 4. Hale's office, the door's been forced and there's... A pause. The kind of pause that meant the person on the other end was looking at something they weren't sure how to describe. You need to come up here. Evelyn stopped on the stairs. Solis looked at her. They both understood the equation. 4 had something they needed to see. Ground floor had something they needed to stop. Splitting up in a building that had already proven to contain at least 2 hostile assets and an unknown tipster was not a comfortable option. But staying together meant one of those problems went unaddressed, and in the next 4 to 5 minutes, the ambulance crew at the ground floor bay was going to make a decision. I'll take the bay, Evelyn said. You're suspended from this hospital. You have no authority. I have your credentials. Solis looked at her for one hard second. You have a federal consultant badge, not a field authority. If this goes sideways, then it goes sideways, Evelyn said. But right now, the only person in this building who knows the layout, knows the staff patterns, and has any chance of walking into that ambulance bay without triggering an immediate reaction is the nurse everyone here already thinks has no idea what she's doing. Another second, Solis's jaw worked. Don't engage, she said. Delay. That's all. Buy me 8 minutes. Evelyn turned and went down the stairs. 8 minutes was a long time in the right circumstances. In the wrong ones, it was nothing at all. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life learning the difference, and she had a feeling that the next few minutes were going to fall firmly in one of those 2 categories, and she wouldn't know which until she was already inside it. She hit the ground floor door and pushed through into the main corridor. The ambulance bay was 40 feet ahead. Through the glass doors, she could see the vehicle, white, clean, no county markings, which was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was that one of the 2 crew members was already inside the hospital, standing at the admissions desk with a clipboard, talking to the intake coordinator with the relaxed body language of someone who had all the time in the world and was absolutely certain they were supposed to be there. Evelyn walked toward the desk without hurrying. The crew member glanced at her as she approached, the automatic, assessing look that people in high-stakes situations gave to every new person who entered their field of vision. She had the DIA badge clipped to her lanyard but angled toward her chest, visible if you looked, not visible if you didn't. She smiled at the intake coordinator, the slightly tired, slightly distracted smile of a nurse at the tail end of a complicated night shift, and reached past the crew member to pick up a folder from the counter. Sorry, she said, discharge paperwork from last night. The coordinator handed it to her without looking up from the screen. The crew member with the clipboard hadn't moved. He was watching her with the kind of attention that was trying not to look like attention, and she could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. She flipped open the folder, whatever was in it, she didn't register, and stood at the counter and appeared to read. 40 seconds passed. The crew member went back to his conversation with the coordinator, asking about a patient transfer to Meridian Regional, 2nd floor, post-surgical. And could they confirm the room number because the paperwork was showing two different bay numbers? The coordinator started typing. Evelyn turned one page in the folder and did not look at the man directly, and thought about the 8 minutes she'd been given and how many of them had already passed, and how the vehicle in the bay still had one person in it, and how whatever was on the fourth floor had been enough to make a trained federal agent's voice go flat on the radio. The coordinator said, "I'm showing that transfer was canceled at," and then stopped, and her face did something uncertain. "I'm sorry, the system is showing a flag on this order. I need to call upstairs." The crew member was quiet for 1 second. Then he looked at Evelyn. Not the casual glance from before. A direct, flat look that lasted just slightly too long, and in the half-second before either of them moved, she knew that he had figured out that she was not reading that folder. And she knew that he knew that the transfer order had just hit a wall. And she knew, with the particular clarity that came from having been in situations like this before and surviving them, that the next 30 seconds were going to determine a great many things. His hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. Evelyn moved first, not toward him, sideways, one step that put the intake desk between them and the coordinator at the same time, and she said in the clear, carrying voice of someone who has made a decision and is not negotiating it, "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the counter and go to the back office right now." The coordinator looked up, took one look at whatever was on Evelyn's face and did exactly that, pushed her chair back, stood, and walked into the back room without asking a single question, which meant she was either very perceptive or had been through a lockdown drill recently, and the muscle memory kicked in. The crew member's hand stopped moving. He was calculating. She could see it, the small adjustments in his posture, the way his weight shifted slightly onto his back foot, the micro-assessment of the lobby. 3 other people visible, an orderly near the far wall, 2 visitors sitting with coffee cups near the entrance. None of them looking. The glass doors to the ambulance bay were behind him. His partner was in the vehicle, which meant 30 feet of open corridor between him and backup. Evelyn set the folder on the counter very deliberately. "The transfer order is flagged," she said. Her voice was even. "Your vehicle is unregistered with Ashford County Dispatch. The patient you're here to transport has a federal hold on his room." She paused. "You can walk out now, or you can wait for the people coming down from the 4th floor. Either way, this ends in the next 2 minutes." He looked at her. His face was professionally blank in a way that civilian faces weren't. The specific absence of expression that came from training, not temperament. "You're the nurse," he said. "The one they suspended." "Yes," she said. Something shifted in his calculation. A suspended nurse with a DIA lanyard in a hospital lobby at shift change was an equation he apparently hadn't been given, and unfamiliar equations made people pause. He paused. That was enough. The stairwell door at the far end of the corridor hit the wall, and Solis's 2 agents came through it fast, and the crew member turned at the sound, and in that half-second of divided attention, Evelyn closed the distance to the desk and put herself between him and the bay doors, which removed his cleanest exit and made the whole geometry of the room shift in a way that he clearly felt because his shoulders dropped in the specific way that meant he was done running the numbers. He put both hands up. Slowly, with the resigned economy of someone who had lost a round but wasn't finished with the game. The agents had him in cuffs before he said another word. Evelyn exhaled through her nose. Her shoulder was talking to her now. Not screaming, but making itself known in the persistent way of something that had been hit hard and wasn't going to let her forget it. She put the back of her hand against the counter briefly, just for a moment of balance, then straightened. The second crew member in the ambulance bay tried to drive out when he saw the agents through the glass. He made it 4 feet before a third vehicle, black, unmarked, plates she didn't recognize, pulled across the exit and stopped him in place. She hadn't seen that vehicle arrive. Solis worked efficiently. The 4th floor was a different kind of wrong. She took the stairs because the elevator felt exposed, and she was on the 3 and 4 when she passed Dr. Priya Osman coming down. The resident stopped when she saw Evelyn, opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the DIA badge, and appeared to make 17 separate decisions in approximately 4 seconds. "What's on 4?" Evelyn said. I was told to clear the floor." "Hale's office." Osman's face did something careful. "There were 2 men, federal badges. They went in with Dr. Hale about 20 minutes ago, and then..." She stopped. One of the orderlies said he heard shouting, then nothing. Where's Hale now? I don't know. She looked genuinely unsettled, which was different from the careful, professional composure she'd worn the night before. He was supposed to start rounds at 6:30. Nobody's seen him. Evelyn went up the last flight. The fourth-floor corridor was empty in the way that corridors were empty when someone had deliberately emptied them. A few discarded coffee cups at the nursing station, a chart left open on a counter, the small debris of a morning that had been interrupted. Two of Solis's people were at the far end, one positioned at the door to the surgical attending suite, and one moving along the opposite wall with her hand at her side. The door to Hale's office was open. She went in. The room was not destroyed, but that was the first thing she noted, because a destroyed room told one story and an intact room told a different one. His desk was clear. His credentials were on the desk, which meant he hadn't taken them when he left. The chair was pushed back at an angle that suggested a rapid exit, not a casual one. The window was open, which in a fourth-floor office with no balcony meant either someone had checked whether it was possible to go that way, or someone had wanted the room to appear as though that was the route taken. On the desk, beside the credentials, was a single piece of paper. She didn't touch it. Leaned over and read it where it lay. It was a transfer authorization for Warren Falk. Different formatting from the one in the hospital system. This one carried a different header, a facility name she didn't recognize. Bridgewater Logistics and Medical Consulting, with an address in Denver. Not a hospital. Not a care facility. The kind of name that existed to sound official until someone looked too closely. Signed by Hale. Time-stamped. 4:50 a.m. He'd prepared this before he came in for rounds. Solis appeared in the doorway behind her. Ambulance bay is contained. What did you find? Evelyn straightened and told her. Solis came around the desk and looked at the paper, then looked at the window, then looked at Evelyn with an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. Bridgewater is a shell, she said. We've seen that name before. It's one of 6 corporate layers over Hargrove's logistics network. She picked up the paper with a gloved hand. Hale has been in contact with Hargrove's organization. For how long? That's what I'd like to know. She looked around the office. And where he went. The orderly from Osmond's account had heard shouting and then nothing. 2 federal badges going into the office, which meant either DIA agents Evelyn didn't know about, or more likely, men using credentials that looked correct from a distance in a hospital corridor. They took him, Evelyn said. Solis looked at her. They came for Falk and they couldn't get to him. The ambulance is blocked. The signal disruptor is confiscated. But Hale prepared that transfer order at 4:50 a.m. He was cooperating with them, has been cooperating, maybe for a long time. And when the operation started coming apart, she looked at the open window. He became a liability. Solis was quiet for a moment that had several layers in it. If they pulled Hale, they're repositioning. The operation here is burned. They know we have the ambulance crew. They know the disruptor failed. They'll cut their losses, Evelyn said, which means the witness they were trying to silence is now their remaining problem, and they still have assets we haven't found. Solis's radio. She answered it, listened, and her jaw went tight. What? Evelyn said. ICU pharmacy on 2, Solis said. One of my agents just found an aerosol device behind the medication dispensing unit. Small, timed release. Not yet activated. She was already moving toward the door. If that activates near the PACU. They were both in the corridor before she finished the sentence. The aerosol device was the size of a thermos and had been placed behind the locked medication dispensing cabinet in the ICU pharmacy, with enough precision to suggest someone who knew the ventilation pattern of that specific room. Evelyn could see it from the doorway. Magnetic back, the same design philosophy as the signal disruptor, but with a different purpose. The pharmacy shared an air handling unit with the PACU recovery suite. Anything released in this room would move through the system within 3 to 4 minutes and would present in the PACU as a respiratory event, patients going into distress, monitors alarming, staff responding to symptoms they couldn't immediately explain. In the chaos, moving one specific patient from one specific bay would be entirely possible. Don't touch it, she said, and the agent who'd been reaching toward it stopped immediately. Can you disable it? Solis asked. Evelyn crouched in front of it without touching the cabinet door further. She could see the timer display from this angle, 14:32, counting down. She could also see the activation mechanism, which was a pressure trigger set into the base, designed so that moving the device incorrectly would release the contents immediately. Whoever built this had anticipated someone finding it and trying to remove it. "It's booby-triggered," she said. "Moving it sets it off." "Then we evacuate the floor." "If we evacuate the PACU, Falk moves through the corridor. That's what they want." Solis crouched beside her. "What's the alternative?" Evelyn looked at the device and then at the air handling panel on the wall. She stood and went to the panel, pulled the cover off with the flat of her hand. The interior showed the ducting junction for this room, a branch system that fed both the pharmacy and the adjacent patient area. There was a manual damper inside the junction, a simple mechanical plate that controlled airflow between the two spaces. It was designed for fire containment and HVAC maintenance. Nobody had ever expected it to be used for this. She reached in and found the damper handle. Corroded. It hadn't been moved in years, and her injured shoulder made the angle brutal. She pulled. It didn't move. She adjusted her grip, used her body weight, felt something tear in the muscle at the top of her shoulder that she was going to be dealing with for weeks, and the damper moved with a grinding reluctance that suggested it had been in one position since approximately 2017. The airflow in the room changed almost immediately. She could feel it. The slight shift in pressure. "Pharmacy is now isolated from the PACU ventilation," she said. Her voice was controlled. Her shoulder was not. "Whatever that device releases stays in this room." Solis looked at her. "You just closed yourself in here with it." "The room has a door." She pointed at it. "Get your people out and seal it from the outside. The device triggers in..." She checked the display. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. When it goes, the contents will be contained in a space with roughly 30 cubic meters of volume. It'll be unpleasant in here for a while, but it won't reach anyone else. I'm not leaving you in here with an unknown chemical agent. You need someone who knows whether the timer can be interrupted without triggering the pressure release, Evelyn said. I need you outside coordinating what's left of this operation. One of us has to be in here, and one of us has to be out there. She met Solis's gaze and held it. Get Falk moved to a secure room, a real one, not the PACU, somewhere with no exterior windows and a door that can be locked from inside. Do it now, before whoever's left in this building makes another move. A moment. Solis was not a person who looked indecisive, but she looked something in that second, something more human than her field mode exterior usually allowed. 8 minutes, she said. If I don't hear from you in 8 minutes, then breach the door with ventilation masks, yes. Evelyn turned back to the device. 8 minutes. She heard Solis move behind her, heard the agents in the corridor, heard the door close, and then she was alone in the pharmacy with the low hum of the HVAC system and a timer at 10:44 and the particular silence of a room that had just been sealed. She breathed for a moment, let herself feel the shoulder. It wasn't good. The range of motion on her left side was already reduced. She could compensate, had been compensating for the last 30 minutes. But she registered it honestly because she'd learned a long time ago that lying to yourself about injury in an operational environment was how situations got worse. Then she looked at the device and started thinking. The pressure trigger in the base meant the bottom was sensitive. The timer mechanism was on top, separated from the activation circuit by a relay that was visible through the casing seam. Small, poorly concealed, the design of something that had been built quickly rather than engineered carefully. Quick builds had shortcuts. Shortcuts had weaknesses. She needed something non-conductive, thin and rigid. She looked around the pharmacy. Medication packaging. A plastic drug information card in the wall holder beside the dispensing unit. The kind of laminated reference sheet that every pharmacy kept and nobody ever read. She pulled it off the wall. The relay was accessible from the side if she could get the casing apart without affecting the base. She worked at the seam with the edge of the card, slow and precise, the way you worked when the consequence of the wrong move was immediate and irreversible. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when the work mattered. That was the thing about her that most people never saw and that had saved more lives than she could count. Not the knowledge, not the training, but the hands, which did not shake regardless of what the rest of her was doing. The seam gave slightly. She worked the card deeper. Timer at 8:20. The relay clip was visible now. A simple connection, the kind used in commercial detonation systems adapted for chemical dispersal. She could see the negative lead clearly. If she could break the circuit at the relay without any movement at the base, the timer would stop and the pressure trigger would remain inactive. She needed something to cut with, or something to slip between the leads without touching the trigger. Her badge. The DIA credential Solis had given her. Plastic backing, thin edge. She took it off the lanyard and worked the edge behind the relay lead. Slowly. The kind of slow that required actively suppressing every instinct that said faster. She felt the edge make contact with the lead, adjusted the angle, thought about a dozen other moments in other dark rooms in other countries where she had done something with her hands that nobody was supposed to know she could do, and felt the strange doubling of past and present that came with muscle memory older than the life she was currently living. The lead separated from the relay. The timer stopped at 6:58. The device sat inert on the floor of the sealed pharmacy. Evelyn sat back on her heels and breathed. Her shoulder sent a message that she acknowledged and set aside. She looked at her hands for a moment. They were entirely steady, which was almost annoying, because she could feel clearly that the rest of her was not entirely steady, and the disconnect was the kind of thing that had always struck her as slightly absurd. She stood, went to the door, and knocked twice. Solis opened it from the outside. She looked at Evelyn, then at the device on the floor behind her, then at Evelyn again. "Device is inactive," Evelyn said. "You'll want your ordnance team for removal and analysis. The chemical contents are unknown. Treat as hazmat until you have a classification." Solis stared at her for a long beat. "How?" Relay interrupt. Quick build. They didn't reinforce the circuit housing. "With a badge." "With a badge." A beat of silence that held something neither of them was going to say out loud. "Falk?" Evelyn asked. "Moved. He's in a secure room on 3, 2 agents on the door, no windows. He's asking for you." "In a minute." She looked down the corridor. "Have you found Hale?" "Not yet. We flagged his credentials, his vehicle, his phone. He hasn't used any of them." Solis paused. "The 2 men who went into his office. We have partial footage from the corridor camera. I'm running it now." "The tipster who called me," Evelyn said. "Have you identified the number?" "Traced to a burner. Bought in Denver 3 weeks ago." Solis moved alongside her as they walked toward the stairwell. "But the call originated from inside this building." Evelyn stopped walking. "Inside the building," she said. "Ground floor. Near the ER entrance." Solis watched her. "Someone in this hospital made that call. Someone who knew about the asset on 2, knew the timing, and chose to warn you specifically rather than contact us directly." Evelyn thought about that. Turned it over. Someone inside the hospital, not DIA, not Hargrove's network, or at least not fully in Hargrove's network. Someone who had watched what Evelyn did the night before and had decided something based on it. Someone who had access to the ER entrance at 6 in the morning. "Pull the ER entrance camera footage," she said. 6 to 6:30. Solis was on it before she finished the sentence. They reached the 3rd floor. Falk was in room 312, which had been a private room before it became a temporary federal holding location, and the 2 agents outside the door both nodded at Solis as she badged through. Evelyn went in. Falk looked worse than he had in the PACU. The movement hadn't helped him, and his color had gone from bad to worse. But his eyes were sharp in the way that mattered, which was the relevant thing. "There were 3 of them," he said without preamble. "In the building. I could hear the radio traffic." "We know," she said. 2 are contained. 1 is unaccounted for." His jaw tightened. "The 3rd one won't be trying anything obvious. That's not how Hargrove's secondary assets work. They're insurance. They stay out of the primary operation and they watch." "Watch for what?" "For this." He looked at her. "For the primary operation to fail. For the asset to still be alive and talking." He shifted slightly, and something in his face contracted. Pain, controlled poorly. "If I'm still breathing and there are federal agents in this building, Hargrove already knows. His insurance protocol activates." "What does insurance look like?" Falk was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, more like he was choosing precision over speed. "The explosives cache," he said. "The 200 kilograms we've been talking about. It's not in storage. It hasn't been in storage for 3 months. Hargrove moved it when his network started getting pressure. He set a trigger." He looked at her steadily. "If he loses contact with a specific check-in for more than 24 hours, or if a field operation fails and his communication goes dark, the cache activates, automated. No one has to push a button." The room was very quiet. "Activates how?" Evelyn said. "I don't have the full target," he said. I was never given the full target, but I know it's in Ashford, a public location, high density. His jaw worked. He built it as leverage, proof to anyone watching that his network could operate without him, that taking him down cost more than it was worth. Evelyn looked at Solis, who was standing in the doorway with her radio already in her hand, and the expression of someone doing rapid, cold arithmetic. How long ago did the ambulance crew fail to complete the operation? Evelyn said. Solis checked the time. 41 minutes ago. Does Hargrove have a secondary contact point in the network? Something that would have registered the operation status? Probably. Solis pressed her earpiece. I need Hargrove's known communication lines, any active check-in protocols, any automated... She stopped, listened. Her face went very still in the way that meant the information coming back was not good. What? Evelyn said. Solis lowered the radio. Hargrove has been offline since 6:15 a.m. She looked at Evelyn. He's not checking in, and if his protocol activates on a missed check-in window... When did his last confirmed check-in happen? Midnight, 6-hour window. Solis held her gaze. Window closes at 6 a.m. It's now 7:47. An hour and 47 minutes past the window. Falk's voice was quiet. The trigger may already be running. And in the silence that followed, the overhead PA system chimed twice, the particular double tone that preceded an emergency announcement. And then the hospital operator's voice came through, steady and practiced, saying the words that turned the corridor outside into immediate controlled chaos. Attention all staff, Code Silver, ground floor, this is not a drill. Code Silver at Redwood Memorial meant one thing, armed individual in the building. Evelyn was already at the door when Solis caught her arm, not stopping her, just for a second, just enough to say, that's the third one. And Evelyn said, I know, and moved into the corridor. And behind her she could hear Falk saying something she didn't catch because the PA was chiming again, and the sound of running feet was coming from the stairwell. And somewhere on the ground floor of the hospital, a door was opening that nobody was going to be happy about. The third asset, the insurance, the watcher, had just stopped watching. And Evelyn Cross had 17 years of training, one badly damaged shoulder, a borrowed federal badge, and the absolute certainty that whatever came through that stairwell door was coming for the one man in this building who could bring down Colonel Denton Hargrove, expose a 6-year conspiracy, and name the people responsible for 6 soldiers who never came home from a mission that should never have happened. She positioned herself at the corridor junction, back to the wall, and waited. The stairwell door opened, and Evelyn had 3/4 of a second to read what came through it. Male, mid-40s, moving fast but not running. The controlled speed of someone with a destination, not someone panicking. Civilian clothes that were slightly too clean for someone who'd been in a hospital since before dawn. Right hand at his side, left hand visible and empty, which meant the right hand was the one to watch. He turned into the corridor and saw her and stopped. They looked at each other for a moment that was very short and felt very long. His right hand came up. Not a weapon. A phone, held out toward her, screen facing forward. On it was a photograph. A man in uniform, standing outside what looked like a forward operating base, squinting against bright sun. She recognized the location before she recognized the man, and then she recognized the man, and something in her chest did something she didn't have a clean word for. My name is Garrett Hines, the man said. His voice was rough, and he was breathing harder than the stairs accounted for. I was Sergeant Rails' RTO, second element, the night of the mission. He lowered the phone slightly. I'm the one who called you. The PA system overhead was still cycling through its Code Silver announcement. Somewhere below them, feet were moving fast and someone was shouting instructions in the clipped language of a security protocol being executed by people who were doing it for real for the first time. Evelyn looked at the phone, at the photograph, then at Hines. The Code Silver, she said. That was me. I told the security desk there was an armed individual in the lobby. His jaw was tight. Because there was. One of Hargrove's people I spotted him at the main entrance about 10 minutes ago. I didn't have a way to reach your DIA contact directly, and I needed the building locked down before he moved. She stepped toward him. Description. White male, 50-something, gray jacket, brown messenger bag. He was checking his phone every 2 minutes. Not sitting. Standing near the column by the east entrance. I saw the same posture in 18 outside a safe house in... He stopped. I know what that posture means. She was already on the radio Solis had given her. East entrance lobby. Gray jacket, brown bag, male, 50 plus. Not medical staff. Solis's voice came back almost immediately. On it. Stay on 3. Hines was watching her with the particular attention of someone trying to figure out how much they could trust what they were seeing. She understood the feeling. She was doing the same thing to him. You were Rail's RTO, she said. Yes. You survived the mission. Something moved through his face. Not officially. I was listed KIA in the after-action report. He said it without drama, which made it worse. Hargrove's people altered the record. I found out 2 years later. By then I'd been living under a different name for long enough that going back felt... He stopped. It felt impossible. She looked at him for another moment. The RTO. The radio telephone operator. The person who would have been on every communication frequency that night. Who would have heard every transmission. Who would have been the clearest possible witness to what happened on those channels, and when and who authorized what. You have the transmission logs, she said. It wasn't a question. I have copies of the original traffic from that night, recordings I made personally on a secondary device. Hargrove didn't know about the secondary device. He reached into his jacket, slowly, watching her watch him, and produced a USB drive. Small, worn, the kind of thing that had been carried around for a long time. 6 years I've been waiting for a moment where using this wouldn't just get me killed. She took it from him, held it for a moment. Why now? She said. Why this morning? Because Falk is alive. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, which was the first fully uncontrolled thing he'd done since he came through that door. I've been watching this network for 2 years trying to find a way in that didn't end with me disappearing. When Falk showed up at this hospital, I knew, if he was talking, if there was a federal operation already running. He looked at her. I've been in Ashford for 4 days. I was watching the hospital. I saw what you did last night in the trauma bay and He stopped again. I recognized the technique from the mission. You were the one who kept Rail alive for 40 minutes after the compound was hit. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. He didn't make it, she said. No, Hines said. He didn't. But you kept him alive long enough for him to give me the secondary recording. Before His jaw worked. He knew he wasn't going to make it out. I gave me the device and told me to run, and I ran. She held the USB drive in her palm and thought about Dennis Rail, who had been 28 years old and had wanted to be a high school football coach after his 3rd tour, and who had died in a compound that should never have been targeted because someone with a colonel's rank had decided his life was an acceptable line item in a transaction. This goes to Solis, she said. I know. And you go on record. Full deposition. Everything you have. I know that too. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they had been carrying something for too long. I came to do exactly that. I just needed to not be dead first. Solis's voice on the radio. East entrance? We have him. Brown bag contained explosive initiators and a remote detonation device. He's in custody. A pause. Cross, we need to talk about the trigger timeline. The conference room on 3 had been converted, without ceremony, into something that looked like a field operations center. Solis's agents had a laptop open, a secure phone line running, and a map of Ashford on the wall with 3 locations marked in red. Falk was there, in a wheelchair now, looking like a man who was running on something beyond what his body should have been able to provide. Hines sat across from him, and they looked at each other for a long moment, and whatever that moment contained was between them and stayed there. Evelyn stood at the wall and looked at the map. The cache, Solis said, coming to stand beside her. Falk gave us what he knows. Hines confirmed 2 of the 3 locations as sites he'd seen referenced in Hargrove's communication traffic 6 years ago. The 3rd is new. She pointed at a red mark near the center of the city. Ashford Central Station, main rail terminus. On a Thursday morning, peak commuter traffic. That building has between 3,000 and 4,000 people in it at any given time between 7 and 9 a.m. Evelyn looked at the clock on the wall. 8:04 a.m. The other 2 locations, she said, City Water Treatment Facility east of downtown and the main support column structure of the Harmon Bridge. Solis's voice was flat, with the effort of keeping it flat. 200 kilograms distributed across 3 sites would be... It would be catastrophic. Do you have a bomb squad response at all three? En route. ETA on the station is 6 minutes. Treatment facility, 9. Bridge, she paused. 12, because of traffic. Is Hargrove still offline? Yes. No check-in, no communication from him in over 2 hours. Solis looked at her. Which means the automated trigger is live. Our tech team is trying to identify the detonation frequency to attempt a signal block, but we don't have the device specifications. Falk doesn't have them. Heinz's recordings reference the cache, but not the technical build. Evelyn thought about the device in the pharmacy, the aerosol unit, the signal disruptor, the ambulance crew. Hargrove outsourced the operations side but kept the technical architecture, she said. Who built the devices? Solis blinked. We don't have a confirmed the device in the pharmacy. The build quality was inconsistent. Solid detonation mechanism, weak relay housing. That's someone who understood ordnance but was working fast or working without full resources. She turned to Falk. Hargrove's network. Who handled the technical builds? Falk thought for a moment. Man named Voss. Civilian contractor, former EOD. Hargrove used him for device construction and modification. He paused. Last I knew, Voss was based in the Denver area. Heinz, Evelyn said, in the transmission recordings. Any reference to a technical contractor? A name, a call sign, anything? Heinz closed his eyes briefly. There was a call sign, 6 years ago, on one of the pre-mission transmissions. Someone Hargrove was coordinating with about package specifications. The call sign was, he pressed his lips together. Crowbar. That was it. Solis was already on the secure phone. Evelyn watched her work and turned back to the map and thought about Voss and Crowbar and a man who built devices with solid bones and weak connective tissue, and what that meant about how those devices received their trigger signal. The relay she'd interrupted in the pharmacy had been a standard commercial circuit, the kind used in remote detonation systems that operated on a specific frequency range. If Voss had built all the devices in this network using the same sourcing, the same design philosophy, then the trigger mechanism across all 3 sites was probably drawing from the same frequency architecture. She turned to the agent on the laptop. Can you get me the frequency range for commercial remote detonation relays, specifically units produced in the last 5 years that use magnetic backhousing? The agent looked at Solis, who nodded. 40 seconds of typing. Most common range for commercial units with that profile is 418 to 433 megahertz. Some go up to 915. If Hargrove's automated trigger broadcasts on that range, a broadband signal block across those frequencies, Solis said, catching it. She was on the phone again immediately. Evelyn went to the window. The city was doing what cities did at 8 in the morning, moving, crowding, filling up with people who had no idea that somewhere in the infrastructure they walked across every day, someone had placed 200 kilograms of reasons for everything to stop. Her shoulder had gone from persistent to insistent. She shifted her weight, and it shifted with her like an argument she couldn't walk away from. She thought about the 6 people who had gone into the compound in 2019 and the one who had come back, and whether what she had spent the last 6 years doing, the quiet hospital work, the unremarkable apartment, the deliberate smallness of her visible life, had been recovery or just waiting. She wasn't sure there was a clean difference. The bomb squad reached Ashford Central Station at 8:11 a.m. and found the device beneath a maintenance platform in the lower concourse. A large case, professionally packed, the kind of placement that suggested someone who had spent time in the building learning its rhythms. The lead tech confirmed military-grade compound and magnetic back initiator housing and transmitted the device specifications to Solis's team at 8:17. Voss's signature was all over it. Same relay architecture as the pharmacy unit, same frequency range. The signal block went active at 8:23 a.m., pushed across the 418 to 915 megahertz range by a mobile unit the DIA had positioned outside the hospital while Evelyn was still in the pharmacy, because Solis had been running contingencies simultaneously and hadn't mentioned it, which was something Evelyn appreciated about her. At 8:26, the bomb squad at the water treatment facility found the second device. At 8:41, the bridge team found the third, in the first support column access shaft, which required a technician to go in on a line because the shaft was 14 meters deep and the device was at the bottom of it. They were down there for 11 minutes, which was 11 minutes that nobody in the conference room spoke during, and when the confirmation came through that the device was contained and the initiator disabled, Hines put his face in his hands and sat like that for almost 30 seconds. Nobody said anything about it. Falk was looking at the ceiling. His color was still bad and his vital signs on the portable monitor weren't where they should be, but his eyes were clear and he said quietly, to nobody in particular, "It's over." "The devices are contained," Solis said. "The network isn't over until Hargrove is in custody." "Find him," Falk said. "He'll have a backup position. He always has a backup position. Somewhere he prepped 3 or 4 years ago when he first started building the network. Somewhere that doesn't connect to any corporate entity or alias we have on record." He looked at Solis. "He's not improvising. He's executing a plan he wrote when everything else was still working." "Where does a man like Hargrove prepare a backup position?" Evelyn said. "Somewhere he has a legitimate reason to be. Hargrove is career military, logistics command. He knows how to use official infrastructure as cover." Falk thought for a moment. "He has a training facility. Outside Denver, maybe 40 miles. He's used it for years. Legitimate use, joint exercises, some civilian contractor work. It has communication equipment, vehicle access, storage." He looked at Solis. "If he's going to ground, that's where." Solis was already moving. Evelyn stayed. She looked at Hines, who had taken his face out of his hands and was now sitting with a particular exhausted stillness. Falk, across from him. Two men who had been carrying the same weight from different directions for 6 years, sitting in a hospital conference room that smelled like stale coffee and dry erase markers, watching the end of something that had cost both of them more than anyone in this room could fully account for. "Hale," Evelyn said. She hadn't forgotten about Hale. Solis paused at the door. "We found him." The room went quiet in a particular way. "He's alive," Solis said. "In a storage facility 3 blocks from the hospital. Tied to a chair, not seriously injured. Hargrove's people were holding him as collateral to ensure the transport order processed cleanly." She looked at Evelyn. "When the operation collapsed, they left him." Evelyn absorbed this, rearranged what she thought she knew. Hale had signed the transport order at 4:50 a.m. But if Hargrove's people had already had eyes on the hospital overnight, if they'd identified Hale as the attending of record and moved on him before the morning operation started. "Was the transport order coerced?" she said. "He says yes. We're verifying." Solis held her gaze. "He also says he wants to talk to you." But they had moved Hale to an examination room on the ground floor by the time Evelyn got there. He was sitting on the edge of an exam table with a blanket around his shoulders and a bruise developing along his left cheekbone, and the look of a man whose understanding of his own position in the world had undergone a significant and recent revision. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. "They came to my office at 5:15, he said. His voice was rougher than usual, and he wasn't performing. That was the main thing she noticed. He wasn't performing. 2 men. They knew my name, my home address, my daughter's school. They put the transport authorization in front of me and told me to sign it, and that if I did what I was told, nobody would be hurt." "And you signed it?" "I signed it." He held her gaze. He wasn't asking for absolution, which she appreciated. "I've been cooperating with an oversight request from a logistics company called Bridgewater for about 8 months. They approached me through a third party, told me they were a medical transport contractor seeking preferred provider status with the hospital. I processed some documentation for them, responded to some inquiries about patient transfer protocols." He stopped. "I didn't know what Bridgewater was. I didn't know what any of it was until this morning when those men walked into my office." She said nothing. "The suspension," he said. "The administrative action against you." He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I wrote that report before I understood what was happening in my own building. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought I was protecting the hospital's liability position. I thought you were a triage nurse who had gotten lucky and overstepped." He said it quietly, without flinching from it. "I was wrong. On every count." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "You were used," she said. "That's real. But you also made it easy for them for 8 months, because you didn't ask the right questions about who was asking." He absorbed that without argument. "Yes. The report that suspended me is on record." "I know." He looked at her directly. "I'll correct it. Formally, completely, in writing, with a full account of this morning and my role in the Bridgewater documentation. Whatever it takes to clear your record." He paused. "I'll take whatever professional consequence that brings." She held his gaze for another moment. There was something she wanted to say, something pointed, something that would have felt satisfying for about 30 seconds and true for maybe 10 of them. She let it go. "You should speak to Agent Solis," she said. "Everything you just told me, you tell her, in detail. The Bridgewater contacts, the documentation, the names of the third-party introducer, all of it." "I will." She turned to leave. "Cross." His voice stopped her. She turned back. He had the look of someone who was finding the right words for something that didn't have good ones. "That man last night, Falk, if you hadn't been in this hospital, if you'd been someone else at that triage desk—" "I wasn't someone else," she said, and walked out. Well, Hargrove was arrested at 11:43 a.m. at the training facility outside Denver. He was in the communications room when the federal tactical team came through, and by all accounts he made no attempt to run, which was either the decision of a man who had made peace with an outcome or of a man who had one more move that nobody had found yet. The team swept the facility for 40 minutes before they were satisfied. Solis relayed the news to the third-floor conference room, where Evelyn had returned because she still hadn't had her shoulder looked at, and the hospital was the logical place to have that conversation. She was sitting in the same chair she'd been in hours earlier when the call came through, and she noted the information and felt something that she didn't try to name. Hines had given the USB drive to Solis and given his full deposition to a federal attorney who had arrived from Denver at 10 a.m. and who had listened to everything with the particular careful attention of someone who understood that what they were hearing was going to be significant for a long time. The transmission recordings from the night of the mission were clear and time-stamped and damning in the specific way that primary evidence was damning. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just there, saying what it said, indifferent to how long it had taken to be heard. Hargrove's voice on the recording, 6 years old, authorizing a coordinate transmission to a third party 47 minutes before the compound hit. His call sign, his authentication code, his voice. Falk had listened to the recording when Hines played it in the conference room. He had not said anything for a while after. "He sold the location for money," Falk said eventually. "That's the part I couldn't prove. That it was purely transactional, that he didn't even have an ideological position, just—" He stopped. "Just money." Hines said, $2.3 million, wired across 4 accounts over 18 months, starting 6 weeks after the mission. Falk closed his eyes. Evelyn, from across the room, said nothing. She had nothing to add to that. 6 people, $2.3 million, and a training facility outside Denver where a colonel had been sitting in a communications room waiting for the tide to come in. Dr. Priya Osman found Evelyn in the hallway outside the conference room at 12:30 p.m. The resident had clearly been working through some version of the morning in her own head because she had the expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion that was simultaneously obvious and difficult to sit with. She stopped in front of Evelyn and said, "The technique you used last night, the compression positioning, I've been trying to find it in the literature since 3 a.m. "You won't find it in the standard literature," Evelyn said. "I know. I found a reference to it in a classified field manual abstract from 2016, Special Operations Combat Medical Training, Advanced Certification Track." She looked at Evelyn with the directness that was either her best quality or her most inconvenient one, depending on the situation. "That's not basic military medic training." "No," Evelyn agreed. "Who are you?" Osman said. Not unkindly, with the honest curiosity of someone who was going to be a good doctor precisely because she asked questions she wasn't sure she'd like the answers to. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "I was a captain. Special Operations Flight Medic, Combat Medical Support, 2 deployments. A third that didn't make it into the official record the way it happened." She paused. "Now I'm a triage nurse who's currently on administrative suspension." Osman was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Hales submitted a correction to your suspension this morning. Before the federal situation, he submitted it at 9:50, according to the timestamp." She paused. "I saw it in the administrative queue when I was clearing my own paperwork." Evelyn looked at the wall for a moment, then back at Osman. "He moved faster than I expected." "I think the morning moved faster than any of us expected." That was accurate. The correction reinstates you with full back pay for the suspension period and includes a formal notation that the original incident report was filed in error. Osmond hesitated. I added a co-signature. I was a witness to what you did in that trauma bay. I thought someone who was actually there should say so on record. Something in Evelyn's chest shifted in a way that took her a moment to process. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was the more complicated feeling of being seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to look. You didn't have to do that, she said. No, Osmond said. I didn't. They stood in the hallway for a moment in a silence that was comfortable in the way that silences sometimes were between people who had both been awake for too long and had stopped editing themselves. Your shoulder, Osmond said. You've been favoring it since I passed you on the stairs. Let me look at it. It can wait. Captain, Osmond said, and her voice had a quiet firmness in it that hadn't been there the night before. It's been waiting since approximately 7 a.m. Sit down. Evelyn looked at her. Then she went into the nearest exam room and sat down, and she let Priya Osmond do her job, which she was good at, and outside in the corridor the hospital was going back to being a hospital, carts and voices, and the sound of a place trying to resume its ordinary rhythm after something extraordinary had moved through it like a current. The shoulder was a partial tear of the supraspinatus and a bone bruise at the acromion. Osmond gave her the diagnosis with the same direct economy she'd used to ask the question, and Evelyn listened and then said, How long? 6 to 8 weeks to full function, longer if you don't rest it. Define rest. Don't use it to disarm chemical dispersal devices. Evelyn looked at her. Osmond looked back. I'm a doctor. I read the incident reports. She began wrapping the shoulder with the careful efficiency of someone who had done this enough that it didn't require all of her attention. There's going to be an investigation, a formal one, institutional and federal. Everything that happened this morning is going to have to be documented and reviewed and processed. I know. Dr. Hale will likely face a review board for the Bridgewater documentation, even if it was coerced. That's how it works. I know that too. Osmond finished the wrap and stood back and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was direct and slightly uncertain in equal measure, like someone about to say something they hadn't decided whether to say yet. When this is over, the investigation, the formal process, the hospital is going to have a vacancy in trauma response coordination. The position has been open for 8 months. Nobody's applied who's... She stopped. Nobody's applied who should have it. Evelyn looked at her. I'm not authorized to offer anything, Osmond said quickly. I'm a second-year resident. I have approximately no authority over anything. I'm just... She straightened. Noting the vacancy. Professionally. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Ashford was doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, full of people who would go to bed tonight not knowing how close the morning had come to being a different kind of day entirely. I'll think about it, she said. Solis found her in the parking garage at 2:15 p.m. Not the level where the morning had started, 2 floors down, where the light was better, and the air didn't smell like something that had happened. Hargrove is in federal custody in Denver, Solis said. He's not talking, but he doesn't need to. Between the transmission recordings, Falk's testimony, Hines' deposition, and what we pulled from the training facility, the prosecution team told me an hour ago they have more than they'll need. She paused. The surviving network members, the ambulance crew, the asset from the lobby, are looking at federal terrorism charges. The woman from the junction room, too. Nobody's getting a light outcome here. Evelyn nodded. I want to formally request that you consider a consulting role with the DIA, Solis said. I can't offer that through normal channels right now, and this isn't the right conversation for the full pitch. But I want you to know the request will be coming through official channels in the next few weeks. She held Evelyn's gaze. What you did this morning, the pharmacy, the lobby, the intelligence on the transport window, that's not something we train for quickly. That's something people either have or they don't. Evelyn looked at the concrete column beside her, then at Solis. I'll read the formal request when it comes, she said. Solis accepted that with a nod. She started to turn, then stopped. Something slightly less professional crossed her face. The records from the 2019 mission, the official after-action documentation. It's going to be corrected as part of the prosecution package. She said it carefully. The personnel listed in that report, their records will reflect what actually happened. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Dennis Rail, she said. He should have been listed posthumous commendation. The recommendation was filed. It disappeared. It'll be found, Solis said, quietly, like a thing she was willing to stake something on. The parking garage was very quiet. Okay, Evelyn said. Solis left. Evelyn stood in the parking garage for a while, not quite ready to move toward her car, not quite ready to call the morning finished. The morning had the particular quality of something that had rearranged things. Not everything, but the load-bearing things, the ones you didn't know you'd been compensating for until the moment you didn't have to anymore. She thought about 6 soldiers in a compound and a man who had sold their location for money and had spent 6 years building a network on the foundation of that transaction. She thought about Warren Falk, who had known and run and finally stopped running in a parking lot 3 blocks from a hospital where a woman he'd been counting on happened to work. She thought about Garrett Hines, who had spent 6 years as a ghost inside his own life, carrying a USB drive that had waited patiently for the right morning. She thought about what Osman had said, the vacancy, the position. She thought about what it meant to be in a building, day after day, being seen as less than you were, and whether that was something you accepted or something you waited out. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, different unknown number from the morning. Not a burner, she could tell by the format. She answered. A voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, crisp. Is this Evelyn Cross? Yes. This is General Wade Ferris, Army Inspector General's office. I've been briefed on this morning's events by Agent Solis. A pause. I understand congratulations are in order, and also that there are some records that need correcting. I'd like to have a conversation, at your convenience, about both of those things. She looked at the ceiling of the parking garage, at the concrete and the fluorescent tubes and the ordinary ugliness of a structure designed for function and nothing else. I'm available, she said. Good. Another pause. Captain Cross, for what it's worth, what happened this morning and what happened 6 years ago. The people responsible are going to face accountability on both counts. I want you to hear that from someone with the authority to mean it. She thought about 6 years, about what accountability meant and whether it was ever fully adequate, and whether the inadequacy of it was a reason not to want it. I hear you, General, she said. She hung up. She stood in the garage for another moment. Then she heard footsteps on the level above her, quick, purposeful, moving toward the stairwell access, and the particular sound of a door opening that should have been locked, because this level of the garage had been restricted by Solis's team, and nobody should have been coming in from above, unless they had a key card or had bypassed the reader, and the only people left in this operation who might need to bypass a restricted access point were people they hadn't accounted for yet. Evelyn's hand moved to the radio at her belt. The footsteps stopped. The stairwell door above didn't close. In the silence that followed, she could hear breathing that wasn't hers. She didn't call it in yet. The radio was in her hand, but she didn't key it, because if the person on the level above her was listening for exactly that, for the crackle of a transmission, the sound of someone alerting someone else, then keying the radio was the thing that told them their window was closing. She stood still instead and listened. The breathing above was controlled, not panicked. Someone who had been trained to manage their breath in situations where breathing wrong got you killed. That narrowed the field considerably, and none of the directions it narrowed toward were comfortable. She moved. Not toward the stairwell, parallel to it, staying below the sight line of the upper level, using the concrete support columns the way she'd been taught to use any available structure. The garage had 4 columns on this level. She put 2 of them between herself and the stairwell and crouched behind the rear bumper of a hospital administrator's sedan that had been there since before this morning started. The footsteps resumed, coming down, not rushing, deliberate. The pace of someone who had already decided what they were going to do and was executing it without hurrying, which was more concerning than running would have been, because running meant uncertainty, and this pace meant none. The stairwell door opened to her level. She saw the shoes first, dark, heavy-soled, not hospital issue. Then the legs, then the frame of a man who moved like someone who had once been physically capable in a professional way and had stayed mostly that way into his mid-50s. Gray hair, close-cropped. His right hand held nothing visible. His left was at his side and slightly back, which was the instinctive posture of someone who was right-hand dominant and keeping their strong side free. He stopped in the stairwell doorway and scanned the level. She knew his face from the photograph in Falk's original brief. She had only seen it once, briefly, when Solis had shown her the partial corridor footage from the fourth floor. But faces like that had a way of staying in memory because they had the specific architecture of authority worn long enough to become arrogance. And that was a face she had seen enough times in enough rooms to recognize on a scan. Colonel Denton Hargrove, who was supposed to be in federal custody in Denver. She keyed the radio. "Solis," she said, very low. "Hargrove is in the parking garage, level 2. He's not in custody." A half-second of silence that felt much longer than it was. "That's not possible," Solis said. "We have confirmation. You have confirmation of someone. Get your people to level 2 now." She clicked off. Hargrove had heard the transmission. His head turned toward the sedan, and she knew he'd triangulated the sound. And there was a moment, very short, maybe 2 seconds, where the next several minutes balanced on a point before they fell in one direction or the other. He started toward the sedan. She stood up. He stopped. They looked at each other across 30 feet of concrete and fluorescent light, and she thought about the fact that she had a shoulder that was wrapped and partially immobilized in a radio and no weapon, and he had whatever he had that she couldn't see yet, and between them was the whole weight of 6 dead soldiers and 6 years and a morning that had dismantled an entire operation, except apparently for this one remaining piece. "Captain Cross," he said. His voice was what she'd expected from the recording, practiced, calm, the voice of someone who had commanded rooms for decades. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then you can wait for Agent Solis," she said. "Solis has the wrong man. Whoever they picked up in Denver was carrying your credentials and your communication device and was using your authentication code," she said, "which means either you set someone up to be arrested in your place or you're going to tell me a different story." Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise. More like recalculation, the kind that happened when a man who was used to controlling information encountered someone who already had most of it. "I need to speak to General Ferris," he said. "You can do that from a federal holding facility. What I have to say can't go through official channels first." He took one step closer, and she didn't move. "There are names in Hargrove's network, people I was building a case against from the inside for 18 months. Names that will disappear if this goes through normal processing. People above my rank who are taking payments from the same source. If Ferris gets filtered information through the standard chain—" "You're telling me you were undercover," she said. "I'm telling you the situation is more complicated than the version you have." She looked at him. She had been looked at by people making complicated arguments in difficult moments for a long time, and she had learned that the quality of the argument was never the thing to pay attention to. The thing to pay attention to was what the person's body was doing while they made it. His right hand was drifting towards the inside of his jacket. "Stop," she said. He stopped. "Both hands where I can see them." A pause. Then both hands came up, slowly, and in his right hand was a phone, not a weapon, which she noted and didn't fully relax about because the jacket still had a left-side profile that suggested it wasn't empty. "The man in Denver," she said. "You sent him there deliberately, to buy time, to create space for me to reach someone I could trust with the full picture. And you decided that person was me. You spent this morning dismantling an operation that took Hargrove's network 6 years to build," he said. "You did it alone, in a building where everyone had already written you off, with a suspended badge and a borrowed credential." He held her gaze. "I decided you were the person least likely to let the wrong version of this story become the official one." The garage was very quiet. She thought about Falk in his hospital bed, saying the situation was more complicated than it appeared. She thought about Hines on a stairwell landing with a USB drive and 6 years of waiting. She thought about the way this entire morning had been a series of moments where the simple version was wrong and the true version required more context than anyone initially offered. She also thought about the fact that Hargrove's hand had moved toward his jacket before he chose to show her a phone, and that sequence mattered regardless of what came after it. "Put the phone on the hood of that car," she said. "Then step back 3 steps and put your hands behind your head." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did it. She crossed to the phone and picked it up without taking her eyes off him. The screen showed an open message thread. Encrypted platform, messages in both directions, the most recent one time-stamped 40 minutes ago. The contact name at the top was a rank and a surname she recognized from the DIA briefing Solis had given her that morning. A name that was not Hargrove's, not anyone they'd arrested, not anyone Falk had named. Deputy Director Callum Marsh, Defense Intelligence Agency. The most recent message from Marsh read, "Do not let them process the Denver arrest until I have spoken to Ferris directly. There are components of this operation that cannot surface through standard channels. Trust no one below director level." She read it twice. Then she looked at Hargrove. "Marsh," she said. "He's been managing the financial pipeline from the Hargrove Network's buyer side for 4 years," Hargrove said. His voice was steady in a way that was either genuine or very well constructed. "I found him 11 months ago. I've been building documentation since then. Everything I have is on that device, encrypted, and the decryption key is in a sealed package with my attorney in Colorado Springs with instructions to deliver it to the Inspector General's office if I don't make contact by 6 p.m. today." The footsteps in the stairwell above them were multiple now. Solis's people, coming fast. "Hargrove," she said before they came through, "is any part of what you just told me a lie?" He looked at her with the direct, unblinking attention of someone who had made a decision about what kind of moment this was. "The man I sent to Denver volunteered. He's a former asset, off the books. He knows what he's doing. He'll surface when I tell him to." He paused. "Everything else I told you is the truth." The stairwell door opened and 3 agents came through with Solis behind them, and Hargrove put his hands further behind his head in the deliberate way of someone who understood exactly what the next 30 seconds required of him and was choosing compliance over conflict. Solis looked at Evelyn, at Hargrove, at the phone in Evelyn's hand. "You need to see this," Evelyn said, and held the phone out. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that moved fast and slow at the same time. Fast because there was always something requiring an immediate decision. Slow because each decision landed in a context that kept expanding the longer anyone looked at it. Solis spent 40 minutes on a secure line with General Ferris. Hargrove was held separately, not processed, while his device was examined by the DIA's technical team under oversight from the IG's office. The sealed package from his attorney was retrieved and opened at 4:30 p.m. in the presence of a federal judge. Callum Marsh was placed under investigative hold at 5:12 p.m. at his office in Washington, D.C. He did not go quietly. The account of it came to Evelyn secondhand through Solis, who described it with the precise economy of someone who had watched a man realize that the scaffolding he'd built his career on had been quietly cataloged by someone he'd never considered a threat. Marsh had apparently made 3 phone calls in the 4 minutes between when the agents arrived and when they took his phone, none of which reached anyone useful because the lines had already been flagged. By 6 p.m., the prosecution package had expanded from a military explosives conspiracy to a 6-year criminal enterprise involving defense appropriations fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of federal investigation at the deputy director level. The attorney prosecuting the case told General Ferris it was the cleanest documentary evidence package she had seen in 20 years, which was a statement that contained the particular irony that Hargrove, the man who had supposedly been the central villain of the morning, had spent 11 months building the case that would bring down the man above him. The actual shape of things was rarely the shape you first saw. Evelyn sat with that for a while. She was in a chair in the 3rd-floor conference room when Solis came back and told her about Marsh, and she listened to all of it, and then she sat in the silence after it and tried to find some version of satisfaction in the arithmetic. 6 years. 6 soldiers. A recording on a USB drive. An encrypted phone. A sealed package with a lawyer in Colorado Springs. It didn't resolve into something clean. She hadn't expected it to. Clean resolutions were for stories, and she had lived enough real life to know that real things ended with loose edges and unresolvable remainders. But there was something in the bottom of the accounting that was real and solid and not nothing. The people responsible were facing what they'd done. Not metaphorically. In rooms with lawyers and federal charges and evidence that was going to take years to fully process and prosecute. That was real. It mattered. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and she had learned a long time ago that insisting on everything was how you failed to recognize something. Falk was moved to a secure medical facility at 6:30 p.m. His prognosis was guarded but not poor. He had given his full testimony and signed the documentation, and when they moved him, he looked at Evelyn in the hallway for a moment and said, "I'm sorry it took this long." She said, "So am I." He nodded. They didn't hug. They weren't those people, and they both knew it. But there was an acknowledgement in that exchange that was more complete than anything more elaborate would have been. Hines left at 7 p.m. on his own feet, with a federal escort and a new set of documentation that would, for the first time in 6 years, allow him to exist under his own name. He stopped in front of Evelyn in the corridor and stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, and the look of a man who had practiced several versions of this goodbye and had decided none of them were right. "Rail would have," he started. "I know," she said. He nodded, walked toward the elevator. She watched him go. The formal review board convened 3 weeks later. Dr. Marcus Hale appeared before it voluntarily with his attorney and gave a complete account of his 8 months of contact with the Bridgewater Network, the introductions, the documentation he'd processed, what he'd understood at the time, what he'd later understood. He was precise and thorough and did not make excuses, which was the thing that the board noted in its written summary. His medical license was placed under a 2-year supervised practice requirement, and he was removed from his position as chief of surgery pending a permanent review. Those were real consequences with real weight, and they settled into the institutional record without drama. He submitted the corrected administrative report regarding Evelyn's suspension 4 days after the parking garage, as he'd said he would. The correction was complete and formal, and included a notation that the original report had been filed without adequate investigation of the facts, and that the actions taken by the nursing staff member in question had been consistent with the highest standards of emergency medical care. That document sat in Evelyn's personnel file, and she read it once, and then she put it in a drawer, because the thing she needed from it wasn't the document itself. The thing she needed from it was what it meant, and what it meant was, you were right and we were wrong, and the record will say so. That was not the same as undoing what had happened, but it was the difference between a lie staying in the official record and the truth replacing it, and that difference was not small. Dr. Priya Osman co-authored a training paper that was submitted to the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery 8 weeks after the events at Redwood Memorial. The paper described a field compression technique for managing posterior iliac hemorrhage in penetrating trauma, with reference to its origins in special operations combat medicine and its demonstrated efficacy in a civilian emergency setting. It did not name the nurse who had used it. It didn't need to. The people who needed to know knew. Osman sent Evelyn a copy with a note that said, "The vacancy is still open. The deadline is end of month. I'm not saying anything else about it." Evelyn read the note twice. Then she picked up the phone. "Okay." The IG's formal review of the 2019 mission was completed 11 weeks after the arrests. The official record was corrected to reflect the accurate sequence of events, the communication intercepts, and the chain of authorization that had compromised the mission. The after-action report was revised. The personnel listings were amended. Dennis Rail's posthumous commendation was awarded at a ceremony at Fort Merritt on a Tuesday morning in November, attended by his family, a wife he'd been married to for 3 years before the deployment, 2 brothers, a father who was 71 and had been told for 6 years that his son had died in a training accident in a location that was never specified. Evelyn attended. She had not planned to speak. She had come because she had been asked by Rail's wife, a woman named Sasha, who had found Evelyn's contact information through a chain of people and had written her an email that was 3 paragraphs long and ended with, "I just want to know what he was doing when it mattered. I want to know what his last hours looked like from someone who was there." Evelyn had written back. At the ceremony, she stood near the back and watched the formal proceedings and thought about what it meant to remember people correctly. Not the way that made you feel better, not the version that softened the edges. The actual truth of who they were and what they did and what it cost them, held precisely and without revision. Rail had been 28 and had wanted to coach football and had spent 40 minutes dying in a compound in a country that would never know his name, and in those 40 minutes he had been present enough and deliberate enough to press a secondary recording device into the hands of his RTO and tell him to run. That was who he was. That was the whole picture. After the ceremony, Sasha Rail found Evelyn near the parking lot. She was in her early 30s, dark-haired, composed in the way that people were composed when they had been composing themselves for a long time. She shook Evelyn's hand and held it for a moment. "Thank you for being here," she said. "He kept someone alive for 40 minutes, Evelyn said, "when he didn't have to, when most people wouldn't have. That's the thing I want you to know." Sasha looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. One nod and it was complete. The trials began in January. Colonel Denton Hargrove, whose situation had turned out to be exactly what he'd claimed in the parking garage, and who had spent 11 months building a case that he'd bet his life on, cooperated fully with the prosecution of Marsh and the remaining network. The question of what Hargrove himself faced was a complicated one that the prosecutorial team was working through, and Evelyn didn't follow it closely because that particular math was above her pay grade and outside her lane, and she had learned that trying to hold all the moral accounting in your head was a way of staying trapped in someone else's story. Callum Marsh stood trial in federal court in February. The case lasted 3 weeks. The evidence, Hargrove's documentation, the transmission recordings from 2019, the financial records from the Bridgewater Network, testimony from Falk and Hines and a dozen other witnesses, was extensive enough that the defense spent most of its time not disputing facts but arguing context, which is what a defense did when the facts were not on its side. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Marsh was convicted on 11 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder of federal personnel, which carried a mandatory minimum that the judge described in the sentencing remarks as appropriately reflective of the severity and duration of the conduct. Evelyn was not in the courtroom. She was in the trauma bay at Redwood Memorial 3 hours into a shift when her phone buzzed with a text from Solace that said only 11 counts, all guilty. She read it, set the phone face down on the counter, finished what she was doing. Then she went to the supply room, which was empty at that hour, and she stood in the middle of it for 2 minutes and let herself feel the full weight of what it meant that a man who had signed off on the deaths of 6 people for money had just been told by a jury of 12 that it mattered, that it would always have mattered, that the 6 years he'd spent building a career on the assumption that it wouldn't were over. 2 minutes. She gave herself 2 minutes. Then she went back to work. The trauma response coordination position at Redwood Memorial was officially posted for the 3rd time on a Tuesday in October, a year and a half after a man had bled out in the parking lot and changed the shape of everything that followed. The job description had been rewritten to include, for the first time, a requirement for field medical experience, specifically combat trauma background. Osman had apparently rewritten it herself and submitted the revision to the HR department with the particular quiet determination that she applied to everything she decided mattered. Evelyn applied on a Wednesday. She was offered the position the following Monday. She accepted it the same afternoon, which was faster than she usually made decisions, and she acknowledged that this probably meant she'd been ready longer than she'd let herself believe. Her first week in the role, she rewrote the triage protocol for penetrating trauma to include 3 field techniques that hadn't been in the department's standard procedure, sourced them properly to the combat medicine literature, and submitted them to the clinical committee for review with a 1-page summary that was direct and documented and did not apologize for anything. The committee approved them in 2 weeks, which was faster than anything had moved through that committee in memory. Dr. Osman told her this over coffee in the break room with the expression of someone trying not to look too pleased with themselves. "You could have done this 4 years ago," Osman said, "when you first started here." "Nobody asked 4 years ago," Evelyn said. "You could have asked." "I know." She didn't say more than that because the full answer was more complicated than the conversation required, and she had gotten better at knowing the difference between things that needed to be explained and things that only needed to be held. The truth was that she had come to Redwood Memorial 4 years ago with the specific intention of being unremarkable, of taking up less space than she was capable of moving through her days without drawing the kind of attention that came with being fully visible. That had been a choice. Not a good one, maybe. Not a sustainable one, clearly, but it had been hers, and it had made sense from inside the particular exhaustion of being someone who had seen too much and lost too much and needed, for a period of time, to simply be quiet. The period of time had ended. She knew that now. It had ended the night a man hit the pavement outside her hospital and the trauma team stepped back from the table, and something in her that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, stepped forward. That was the thing about being underestimated for long enough. Eventually you stopped needing the estimation. You knew what you were. The question was just when you decided to stop hiding it. Solace called in December. She was in Washington. The DIA consulting offer was formal now, in writing, with a scope that was specific and a time commitment that was reasonable and a rate that indicated they had actually looked at her record when they made it. The conversation was short and professional. and they both understood what was being offered and accepted without either of them making it more dramatic than it needed to be. Evelyn said yes. She said yes because the work was necessary, and she was good at it, and she had spent a significant portion of her life finding reasons to do less than she could. She said yes because Solis was competent and straight, and had the specific kind of integrity that made collaboration possible. She said yes because Garrett Hines was consulting for a different federal office now, and Falk was recovering, and Rail's wife had sent her a Christmas card with a note that said thank you for remembering him correctly. And she had read that note in her car in the hospital parking lot and sat with it for a long time before she could drive. She said yes because the alternative was pretending she was something smaller than she was, and she was done with that. The shoulder healed in 10 weeks. She was 2 weeks ahead of Osmond's estimate, which Osmond pointed out with academic satisfaction was because she had actually rested it, which Evelyn didn't argue because it was true, and she had learned that not arguing true things saved energy for the things worth arguing about. She kept the apartment. She still liked it. The smallness, the old building, the uneven sidewalks, the trees. She just stopped treating it like a place she was hiding in. Small things. The kind of adjustments that looked like nothing from the outside and were, from the inside, everything. She had a plant now. On the kitchen windowsill. She killed the first one in 3 weeks because she forgot to water it, which was exactly the kind of outcome she should have expected and didn't take personally. The second one was still alive as of December, and she had put a reminder on her phone, which was not a romantic solution but was an honest one. And she had come to believe that honest and imperfect was almost always better than the alternative. On the last Thursday of December, she went back to the trauma bay for a night shift. Not because she had to. Her coordination role had reduced her floor hours significantly. But there was a covering nurse down sick, and the charge nurse had sent a message asking if anyone available could pick up. And Evelyn was available, and she said yes. It was quiet for most of the shift. The particular quiet of a winter Thursday, the kind of night that felt like the city was holding its breath between holidays. She restocked supply carts and reviewed incident reports, and drank bad coffee from the staff machine, and talked to the overnight charge nurse about nothing consequential for 20 minutes, which was the kind of conversation she'd gotten better at allowing. At 2:14 a.m., an ambulance backed into the bay. She was at the triage desk. She stood up. The paramedic's voice on the radio was calm and fast, and she listened to the mechanism of injury and the vitals and the access situation, and she was already moving before the bay doors opened. The resident on call was a third year she hadn't worked with before, and when the gurney came through the doors and the resident's eyes went wide at what he was looking at, Evelyn moved to the left side and said, in the clear, even voice of someone who had done this in harder circumstances than a trauma bay, "I've got it. Tell me what you need." The resident told her. She did it. Not perfectly. Nothing in a trauma bay was perfect. There was always something that didn't work the first time or hit the wrong angle or required improvising because the training and the reality were never exactly the same shape. But she did it with competence and clarity and the particular calm that came not from not caring but from caring exactly the right amount. Enough to do the work, and not so much that the work stopped her hands from working. The patient made it to OR 2 at 2:41 a.m. with stable pressure and a fighting chance. In the bay afterward, the third-year resident looked at her. He had the look of someone in the process of recalibrating something. "Where do you usually work?" he said. "Here," she said. "Trauma response coordination, night shift coverage." "Before that?" She picked up her chart. "Triage." He looked at what she'd done in the last 27 minutes and then looked at her in the specific way that young doctors sometimes looked at things they didn't have a category for yet. "Who taught you?" he said. She thought about that for a moment, about the answer and whether it was simple or not, and whether this was the right moment for the long version or the short one. "Some lessons," she said, "only come from certain places." She walked back to the triage desk. Outside the bay windows, Ashford was doing what it did at 2:47 a.m., sitting in its own silence, indifferent and ongoing, full of ordinary people sleeping through a night that would end without incident because 3 devices had been found in time, and one man was in a federal facility, and another man's case was working its way through the courts, and a woman who had spent 4 years being invisible had decided, one ordinary night, to stop. That was the thing nobody told you about strength. Not the dramatic version, not the moment you saved someone, or turned the room or did the impossible thing under pressure. Those moments were real, but they weren't the whole story. The harder thing, the quieter and more demanding thing, was the decision to be fully present in your own life. To take up the space you were entitled to. To stop performing smallness for the comfort of people who found your actual size inconvenient. She had spent years making herself easy to overlook. She had stopped. Not cleanly, not in one decision, not without cost. There was no version of this that didn't include the people she'd lost, and the years she'd spent sideways, and the night she'd stared at the kitchen wall with cold tea she didn't drink. Those things were in the accounting too. They didn't disappear because the story had moved forward. But the story had moved forward. She sat at the triage desk in the quiet of the third year of the morning and opened her next report and wrote clearly and completely, without abbreviation, the full account of what had happened in that trauma bay, the technique, the reasoning, the outcome, in language that anyone reading the file would understand and that would stay in the record and be useful to someone someday who needed to know that a thing was possible. She signed it with her full name, Captain Evelyn Cross, Trauma Response Coordinator, Redwood Memorial Hospital, Ashford, Colorado. All of it, not less.